Just as the Lord gave King Ahaz a sign that he could trust Isaiah, the Lord will give his people in the last days a sign that the great and dreadful day of the Lord is at hand. Then he'll give a second sign to herald the actual commencement of that day. Anciently, Isaiah gave King Ahaz a sign that Jerusalem would not be overthrown by Syria and Ephraim. The sign was that a young woman in Ahaz's entourage would conceive and give birth to a son, and that she would call that son Emmanuel, or God with us. It's likely that this sign to Ahaz was fulfilled with the birth of his own son, Hezekiah, who walked with God throughout his life and ultimately saved Jerusalem through his faith. And of course, this prophecy was fulfilled again in the meridian of time with the birth of Christ. And as all things that Isaiah spake shall yet be, this prophecy will have another fulfillment in the last days, when the church of God, which John the Revelator called a woman, gives birth to Zion, the New Jerusalem. Two signs will herald the coming of the great and last day. The first will be a signal to the covenant people, and the second will be something that everybody around the world will see. Isaiah doesn't directly mention the first sign, as it comes before his timeline begins, but he does allude to it. The sign will come when the Lord's servants are called home from preaching the gospel around the world. Through types and metaphors, Isaiah prophesies that in the last days, the great superpower on the earth will be turned against itself. Using Egypt as a type of this great power, he says, "And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight every one against his brother, and every one against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. And the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof." In this atmosphere of civil war, it'll be too dangerous to send out the Lord's servants, and the Lord confirms this in the Doctrine and Covenants. "Therefore tarry ye, and labor diligently, that you may be perfected in your ministry, to go forth among the Gentiles for the last time, that their souls may escape the wrath of God, the desolation of abomination which awaits the wicked. Verily I say unto you, let those who are not the first elders continue in the vineyard until the mouth of the Lord shall call them," meaning call them home. "For not many days hence, and the earth shall tremble and reel to and fro as a drunken man. And after your testimony cometh wrath and indignation upon the people. For after your testimony cometh the testimony of earthquakes, that shall cause groanings in the midst of her. And men shall fall upon the ground, and shall not be able to stand. And all things shall be in commotion, and surely men's hearts shall fail them, for fear shall come upon all people." The repeated phrase, "after your testimony," means after the Lord's servants have finished bearing testimony to the Gentiles. When that time comes, they'll be called home, and the Lord will bear his own testimony of earthquakes. This has also been stated by one of the Lord's prophets in General Conference. All we have yet experienced is scarcely a preface to the sermon that is going to be preached. When the testimony of the elders ceases to be given, and the Lord says to them, "Come home, I will now preach my own sermons to the nations of the earth," all you now know can scarcely be called a preface to the sermon that will be preached with fire and sword, tempests, earthquakes, hail, rain, thunders, and lightnings, and fearful destruction. That was from Brigham Young. And lest we forget, Isaiah's first prophecy in his timeline is of massive earthquakes. That's how the whole thing begins. "And they shall go into the holes of the rocks, and into the caves of the earth, for the fear of the Lord shall come upon them when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. In that day a man shall cast his idols of silver and his idols of gold to the moles and to the bats, to go into the clefts of the rocks and into the tops of the ragged rocks, for the fear of the Lord shall come upon them when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth." These earthquakes will be the first events in Isaiah's timeline. They'll be so severe that carcasses will be torn in the midst of the streets, and people will flee to the hills. They'll throw away their gold and silver because money will have no value. And because of the earthquakes, the whole staff of bread and the whole stay of water will be taken away. These earthquakes will affect all nations, including the cedars of Lebanon and the oaks of Bashan, meaning they'll even affect the elite and powerful people of the covenant. So, the first sign, right before the timeline commences, is that of the Lord's messengers being called home. The second sign will be the testimony of earthquakes, signaling that the day of the Lord's fierce anger is now commencing. It'll be a 1-2 punch, spiritually and temporally, that'll change everything. Until then, God says, "Stand ye in holy places, and be not moved, until the day of the Lord come. For behold, it cometh quickly, saith the Lord." I'm Curtis Taylor with the Words of Isaiah.